When the war ended, people spoke as if life was supposed to fall back into place. For me, it didn't. The uniform was turned in. The routine disappeared. And not long after that, I was told, without anger, without explanation, that there was no longer a place for me where I had once belonged. No argument was offered. None was expected. It was simply over. I packed what little I had left and drove. I didn't know exactly where I was going. I only knew that standing still felt worse than moving. Roads thinned, towns grew smaller. The noise of the world faded, and for the first time in a long while I could hear my own thoughts again. I didn't talk about the war, not because I was hiding from it, but because the people who asked had never needed the answers. They wanted stories. I had habits, discipline, the instinct to deal with whatever was in front of me and move on. That instinct is what led me to the cabin. No one advertised it. No one cared what happened to it. It was mentioned casually, almost as a joke. An old structure on land most people had already forgotten. Something no one wanted the trouble of dealing with anymore. When I first saw it, I understood why. The roof sagged. The wood was split and dark with age. Wind slipped through gaps that should have been sealed years ago. It didn't look abandoned so much as dismissed, like it had already been written off. Most men would have turned around. I didn't. I stood there longer than I needed to, long enough to notice that despite everything it was still standing, still resisting weather and time, still doing the one thing it had been built to do: hold. I didn't buy the cabin because I thought it would become something impressive. I didn't imagine a fresh start or a new life. I bought it because no one else wanted the responsibility of keeping it alive. There was no big plan, no vision worth talking about. Just a quiet decision to take something broken that had been cast aside and see if it could still serve a purpose. What that cabin eventually became wouldn't mean much to anyone passing by. But what rebuilding it did to me, that was something I didn't understand at the time. I only knew that, for the first time since the war ended, I had something solid in front of me. And that was enough to begin. After the war, time lost its shape. There was no formation to wake up to, no orders breaking the day into clean pieces. The structure that had once held everything together disappeared, and nothing replaced it. I took whatever work came. Short-term, physical, the kind that didn't ask questions and didn't offer explanations. That suited me. I kept my life light. Old habit. Everything I owned could be moved quickly. Places were temporary by design. I didn't settle long enough to be asked why I had come, or why I would leave. People asked if I planned to go back. I never answered directly. Where I had come from no longer existed in any way that mattered. The place had moved on. Or maybe I had. Either way, returning wasn't an option that meant anything. What stayed with me from the war wasn't fear or anger. It was discipline. The understanding that progress comes from dealing with what's in front of you, not from waiting for conditions to improve. You fix what you can with what you have. You move forward without needing permission. That mindset carried me farther than I expected. One evening, after hauling scrap for a man who barely remembered my name, I stopped at a small roadside diner. The air smelled of old coffee and grease. A radio hummed softly behind the counter. No one paid me much attention, which I preferred. I sat longer than necessary. Not from hunger, but because the noise gave me distance from my own thoughts. That's when I heard about the cabin. It wasn't pitched as an opportunity. Just an offhand remark about a piece of land no one wanted. Too far out. No utilities. An old structure that wasn't worth the trouble. The man talking laughed as he said it, already finished with the idea. I didn't ask questions, but it stayed with me. Not the land, the responsibility. A few days later, I went to see it. The road narrowed until it stopped pretending to be a road at all. I parked and walked the rest of the way. The air grew colder, quieter, the kind of quiet that doesn't rush you. The cabin stood at the edge of a small clearing, as if the land had once made space for it and then forgotten why. Up close, it looked tired. The roof sagged where water had settled for years. Boards were split and gray with age. Old nails worked themselves loose, rusted and bent. It didn't look dangerous. It looked neglected. I walked around it slowly, checking angles out of habit. The frame still held. The structure hadn't failed. It had simply been left alone. That mattered. I stood there longer than I planned to. Long enough to feel the cold settle into my hands. Long enough to understand the amount of work it would take just to make the place hold against weather again. It wasn't inspiring. It was practical, and that made the decision simple. I didn't think about what it could become. I thought about what it needed not to collapse. That night, I slept in my truck nearby. Wind pressed against the walls, testing them. The cabin answered back with sound, not complaint, just movement. It held. In the morning I went into town. I bought only what mattered. Tools that could do more than one job. Materials that wouldn't need replacing soon. I didn't talk much while loading them. The man at the counter watched quietly, the way men do when they recognize intent. I worked until my hands ached, cleared debris, pulled away what no longer belonged, covered the worst sections of the roof just enough to stop the leaks. Each repair made the place quieter, more solid. That first night inside the cabin wasn't comfortable. The floor was uneven, the air cold and heavy. But it was enclosed, protected. The wind stayed outside. I ate sitting on the floor in silence. For the first time since the war ended, I wasn't passing through somewhere. I was staying. And that changed the weight of everything that followed. Work imposes order when nothing else will. The first days followed a simple pattern. I woke with the light, not the clock. Cold decided when the day began. I ate what I had, then worked until my hands stopped responding the way I wanted them to. When they did, I rested just long enough to start again. There was no written plan. The cabin made its own demands. The roof came first. Water always finds a way in if you let it. I moved carefully, testing each step before trusting it. Temporary repairs went in where they mattered most. Not elegant, not permanent, enough to stop the leaks, enough to buy time. Once the dripping stopped, the space changed. The air felt less hostile. Rain sounded different. Small improvements have a way of spreading. Next came the door. It barely deserved the name. Wind slipped through every gap, carrying cold and damp with it. I rebuilt the frame where it had softened, sealed what could be sealed, replaced what couldn't. The first time it shut without rattling, the cabin felt deliberate instead of accidental. That night, I slept longer than I had in weeks. After that, the work found its rhythm. Clear what doesn't belong. Keep what still has use. Stack materials where they won't rot. Burn what can't be saved. The routine mattered more than speed. Rushing only creates problems that return later. I learned the land as much as the structure. Where water lingered after rain, which side took the wind hardest, where the sun stayed longest in the afternoon. Those details shaped decisions better than any plan on paper. When I needed supplies, I went into town. The hardware store was small and patient. The man behind the counter didn't push conversation. He watched what I picked instead. Tools that could do more than one job. Materials that would last. He nodded once as if something had been confirmed. Back at the cabin, I turned my attention to the floor. It wasn't failing, but it wasn't trustworthy either. Cracks ran in places that suggested time and weight had made adjustments. I cleaned it thoroughly, not to make it look better, but to see what I was working with. Clean surfaces tell the truth. The foundation was still sound. That mattered more than anything else. I marked areas that would need reinforcement later and left them alone. Some problems are solved correctly only when the time is right. Food stayed simple, coffee strong enough to matter, meals that didn't require attention. I cleaned everything as I went. Order prevents small problems from becoming large ones. At night, the cabin tested itself. Wind pressed against the walls. Temperature dropped fast after sunset. The structure responded with creaks and groans, not complaints, just information. Over time, I learned what was normal, what wasn't. That predictability mattered more than comfort. I didn't think far ahead. I focused on the next task. the next repair, the next improvement that would make tomorrow slightly easier than today. That mindset had carried me through places far less forgiving than this. Some evenings, when the light faded and the work was done, I sat on the steps outside and watched the trees move. I didn't feel lonely. I felt occupied. There's a difference. Loneliness asks for something you don't have. Occupation reminds you of what you can do. The cabin responded to attention. Drafts disappeared. Sounds softened. The space felt smaller, not because it shrank, but because it began to belong to something, to someone. I slept better. My body adjusted to the work. Muscles hardened. Hands stopped blistering. Pain became information instead of warning. One afternoon, clearing scrap near the back of the cabin, I found an iron stove buried beneath debris. Rusted, neglected, but intact. The kind of thing that had once been essential. I didn't install it right away. I cleaned it first. Took it apart as much as I could. Checked seals, measured clearances. Some things deserve patience. As the days passed, the cabin stopped feeling like something I was rescuing. It started to feel like something that was meeting me halfway. I hadn't made it attractive. Anyone looking for that would have been disappointed, but it was stronger, quieter, honest. And somewhere in that process, without any moment marking it clearly, I realized something else had shifted. I wasn't waiting anymore. Not for instruction, not for permission, not for a place to belong. The work had given me that. And once a man has something solid under his hands, he stops needing explanations. Silence changes the longer you stay with it. At first it feels empty. Then it grows heavy. If you don't fight it, it eventually becomes honest. By then the cabin had settled into a rhythm. The urgent repairs were done. What remained was maintenance, observation, and patience. I worked slower, not from hesitation, but because there was no reason to rush. The place would reveal its problems in its own time. Mornings were the quietest. No engines, no voices, just light shifting through the trees and the sound of small movements outside. Birds mostly. Occasionally something heavier, careful enough to avoid being noticed. I made coffee the same way each day. Ate without distraction. Let the cold finish waking me up. There was no one to impress and nothing to explain. That kind of freedom takes getting used to. The silence brought memories with it, not the ones people expect. Not chaos or fear. Those stayed where they belonged. What surfaced instead were habits. How my body reacted to sudden sound. How I still positioned myself instinctively near walls or exits. I noticed them without judgment and went back to work. The land required attention beyond the cabin. I cleared fallen branches, redirected runoff, shaped the ground so water moved away from the foundation instead of toward it. Digging leaves little room for wandering thoughts. Movements replace sentences. Pressure and balance replace memory. That kind of work tells the truth. As days passed, isolation deepened, not in distance but in awareness. I realized how rarely I had been truly alone before. Even crowded places have noise to hide behind. Here there was nothing between me and my thoughts. At first, questions arrived uninvited. What came next? How long I would stay? Whether this was temporary? I didn't answer them. Answers closed doors too early. One afternoon, the wind rose without warning. It pressed hard against the cabin, testing every repair I'd made. I stayed inside, listening, not anxiously, but attentively. The walls answered back. No new drafts, no sudden shifts. The structure flexed and held. I felt a quiet satisfaction, not pride, but confirmation. The work mattered. That night, the temperature dropped sharply. The next morning, I installed the stove. It took time. The pipe needed precise fitting. Clearances measured carefully. Mistakes there don't announce themselves. They wait. When the fire finally caught, warmth spread slowly, steadily. The cold retreated to the edges. I slept deeply. Days fell into a pattern I trusted. Work. Maintenance. Observation. Rest. Weeks passed without ceremony. The world outside felt distant, not threatening. Then the silence changed again. It was subtle. A sound out of place. Footsteps where there shouldn't have been any. A vehicle idling too long beyond the trees. Nothing dramatic. Just enough to register. I didn't react immediately. Patterns tell the truth if you give them time. I noticed tire tracks where there hadn't been any before. Fresh. Heavy. Not belonging to anyone nearby. They came and went without stopping at the cabin. That bothered me more than if they had. The land felt observed. Not aggressively. Curiously. As if something were being evaluated. I told myself it was nothing. Hunters pass through. Surveyors make mistakes. But the feeling stayed. A few days later, I found a small marker near the edge of the property. A thin flag pressed into the soil. I pulled it out and examined it. It meant little by itself. But it meant something had changed. I considered going into town to ask questions, then decided against it. In small places, information travels with attention. I wasn't ready for either. Instead, I returned to work. I reinforced areas I'd planned to address later. Walked the perimeter slowly, learning it by steps instead of measurements. Boundaries understood that way stay with you. At night, I listened more closely. The forest didn't feel hostile. It felt alert. That realization didn't scare me. It focused me. Whatever this place was becoming, it wouldn't be given. It would be held, quietly, without display. I had learned that lesson before, and I knew better than to ignore the moment when silence stops being empty and starts paying attention. I didn't go looking for answers. They surfaced while I was working. The marker I'd pulled from the ground stayed on the bench for days. I didn't throw it away. Objects like that are messages, whether they're meant to be or not. Someone had measured something. Measurements imply intent. I kept my routine unchanged. Along the back wall, the ground sloped more than it should have. Years of runoff had carved a shallow path, weakening the area over time. I dug channels to redirect the water. Slow, deliberate work, the kind that forces you to look closely. That's when I noticed the line in the floor. It wasn't a crack, too straight, too clean. It cut across the concrete in a way that didn't belong to settling or age. I swept the area until the surface was bare and knelt down, running my fingers along the seam. It formed a square. Someone had planned this. I didn't open it right away. Impulse ruins good discoveries. I finished the task I'd started and left the slab alone. That night, sleep came lightly, not from fear but from awareness, the sense that something had been built here with intention. The next day, I tested the slab. It was heavier than it looked, balanced to resist casual movement. I used leverage, slow pressure, the same way you move things that don't want to be found. The concrete shifted, revealing a dark opening beneath. Cool air rose from it, dry, stable. A ladder descended into darkness. I closed it again and sat for a long time. Whoever built this didn't expect it to be found quickly, or easily. They expected patience. That afternoon, I went into town. I didn't ask direct questions. I listened. Places like this remember things, even when people think they don't. Between casual remarks and unfinished sentences, I learned enough. The area was being reassessed, quietly. Parcels that had been ignored for years were suddenly being looked at again. Not aggressively, yet. But attention had shifted. I returned to the cabin knowing that timing mattered. When I finally opened the space beneath the floor again, I went down carefully. The chamber was small and precise. Stone walls fitted by hand, dry despite the years, no clutter, no supplies. Just a steel lockbox anchored into the stone, and a set of documents sealed and protected. I didn't read everything at once. I never do. I learned the language first. The terminology. What the land actually represented. The cabin wasn't here by accident. It sat above something essential, something that couldn't be moved or replaced. The land hadn't been ignored because it was worthless. It had been ignored because it was inconvenient. I secured the chamber again before nightfall and returned to the work above. The cabin still needed attention. The land still demanded care. I kept my routine steady. That mattered. A few days later, a letter arrived. Polite, carefully worded, an expression of interest paired with a number that looked generous if you didn't know what you were holding. I read it once and set it aside. The next letter came sooner, firmer, a reminder of processes and timelines, of how things usually went for people who didn't understand the value of what they owned. I didn't respond. Instead, I gathered what I needed from the chamber below the floor, not to confront anyone, but to establish clarity. Pressure doesn't require resistance. It requires certainty. I went back into town, this time to speak with someone who understood how land and intent intersect. I laid out the documents without explanation and waited. He read slowly, carefully. When he looked up, his expression had changed. "This isn't what they think it is," he said. "No," I replied. "It isn't." For the first time since the war ended, I felt aligned, not defensive, not reactive, prepared. The cabin hadn't revealed a secret meant to make me rich. It had revealed a position, one that carried responsibility as much as leverage. A line drawn long before I arrived. Now that I stood on it, the question wasn't what I would gain. It was what I would hold. I didn't feel victorious when things finally settled. Victories make noise, they announce themselves. What followed didn't. The pressure eased the way it had arrived, quietly. Letters changed tone. Conversations slowed. Words like offer became proposal. Deadlines softened into discussions. People who had spoken as if decisions were already made began asking questions instead. That shift mattered more than any number on paper. I didn't raise my voice or hurry the process. I returned calls when necessary and let silence do what it does best. Facts don't need to be repeated. They wait. When the agreement took shape, it was precise. No photographs, no handshakes meant for display, just boundaries drawn clearly and respected. Access without ownership, use without control. Terms that acknowledged what existed rather than trying to overwrite it. I signed when it made sense, not to gain something new, but to secure what was already there. After that, the work returned to being simple. The cabin didn't change dramatically, it didn't need to. I finished what I had marked weeks earlier. Reinforced areas where spring runoff might return, sealed joints that had survived winter but wouldn't survive another. I installed the final section of piping with care and tested it twice before trusting it. The place grew steadier, not quieter, more certain. One morning, standing outside with coffee in my hands, I realized I wasn't watching the road anymore. I wasn't waiting for another letter or a visit. The land felt settled, and so did I. The war had taken structure away. The years afterward offered nothing to replace it. The cabin hadn't restored what was lost. It had given me something better. Agency. I decided when work began, when it ended, what mattered immediately, and what could wait. Responsibility wasn't assigned. It was chosen. That changed how I carried myself. People in town noticed, though no one said it directly. They stopped calling the place abandoned. They used my name instead. Not because I asked them to, but because ownership isn't declared. It's recognized. Winter came early that year. Snow pressed hard against the roof. Wind tested every joint. The stove carried its weight without complaint. Each night the cabin held, exactly as it had been built to do. I slept deeply, not from exhaustion, but from confidence. On the coldest night, the wind moved through the trees with enough force to remind me of other places, other nights. I listened without tension. The walls answered back, solid, predictable. That was when I understood what it meant to hold ground. It isn't about force. It isn't about standing still. It's about knowing what to reinforce and what to leave alone. Knowing when to speak and when silence is stronger. Knowing that strength doesn't announce itself. It shows up every day. The cabin never became impressive. Anyone expecting that would have missed the point. It became reliable, honest, capable of doing what it was meant to do. So did I. The war didn't define me. Being dismissed afterward didn't either. What defined me was what I chose to build when no one was watching, and what I refused to give up when it would have been easier to walk away. Some ground isn't claimed. It's held, and once you learn that difference, you stop needing permission to stand where you are.